Thank you for joining today's speaker series. We have a really exciting guest speaker with us today. My name is Brett Wallace. I'm a sales leader within our Sales Solutions group here at LinkedIn, which is one of our 3 lines of business, and I'm really excited to kick off today's speaker. So let me just take a step back and just share with you what our speaker series is about. So our speaker series is meant to essentially help our employees be more productive and successful in their roles through learning and development, which in turn will help us fulfill our mission at LinkedIn, which is to connect the world's professionals to help them be more productive and successful. And today's speaker believes that ideas are the most powerful tools we have in business. And her passion is to help everyone tell their world-changing idea differently. She's a renowned thought leader, having led Duarte Design over the last 25 years and helping clients tell great stories. She's a tremendous influencer on LinkedIn, actually, as well as a renowned TED speaker, and has helped codify what makes great stories so great. Many of you will have access to her materials after this, including her book, Resonate, which is a game changer in the storytelling industry. And I personally couldn't be more excited to welcome her. I actually reached out to Nancy on LinkedIn after I published a few of my own stories, some hand-sketched stories about LinkedIn earlier this year. And we had the chance to meet. She shared some incredible input with me that has helped me take my own practice to the next level. I consider her a huge source of professional inspiration and a friend, and I'm really pleased to welcome Nancy Duarte to LinkedIn.
It's good to be here. Thank you. Nice turnout. I appreciate that. So today we are going to talk about ideas and how you spread ideas. Because like Brett said, when you have an idea, I think it is the most powerful device we have. Everything that you do, you're doing because it was a vision in someone's mind at one point in time. In fact, everything in this room was invisible in someone's mind, and it became reality based solely on how they chose to communicate it. So ideas lead us into the future. When you say, oh, I have an idea, what you're saying, I'm dreaming about a better future. And that's really what ideas are about, if you communicate them well. Once an idea is communicated, it can generate an organization or it can generate an initiative. And you guys have a lot of those going around here. So what happens is an idea is like life. You know, we're born, we live, we die. An idea does the same thing. It starts, it grows, it matures, and then it starts to decline. Unless somewhere between growing and maturing, you reinvent yourself. And then you have to reinvent yourself all the time. So as an employee, it feels like we're always on the go. It's like we're chasing away from our past and trying to reach this future state. And we feel like we never get there because we always have to reinvent ourselves. My own shop has had 5 reinventions where we've repositioned ourselves or started a new service where we've actually imagined what presentations are going to be like in the future. So we're constantly going somewhere in the future. And we have to do that because in 18 months, your clients are going to be at a different place in the future. Somebody can step in, change your world, rock your world. So you have to be a step ahead and constantly thinking about the future and how to make it a better place. And the best way to do that is through story. So I spent 3 years of my life just studying story because story is this interesting container. It's this crazy structure that helps communicate information. So if you look at pre-literate generations for thousands and thousands of generations, they could pass on their little culture, their morals, their folklore. They could pass it down. And it stayed pretty much intact just from the verbal transference of the information. And story, the other thing about it is we physically react to story. If you're listening to a good story, your heart might race. You might not know it, but your eyes actually dilate when you're listening to a really good story. You get chills down your spine, you laugh, you clap, you lean forward, you jump back. Those are all physical reactions to stories. And I realized that it's the same setting when it's a storyteller and an audience as it is when it's a presenter and an audience. But I noticed once we put slides in the mix, everything just flatlined. No physical response whatsoever to what's going on. And I wanted to find out why. And what's interesting is when someone says, that resonates with me. What you just said resonates with me. What they're saying is something you said rang inside of me is true. Oh, what you said feels true to me. Well, the only way to do that is to send a signal out and have it hit something already inside your audience. So often we stand up in front of a crowd and we have this agenda, we have what we want to say, and our boss said, oh, make sure you include this, 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 and this. But in reality, you need to send a signal through, and it hits something that's already inside of them. It's just like the physics phenomenon of resonance. You send a signal out. If you hit the receiving object's resonant frequency, it vibrates. It actually moves. It shakes. So I want to actually show you the physics phenomenon of resonance. I have what's called a Chladni plate. My son-in-law made this for me. It's a steel plate, and he's poured salt on it. And what you're going to see is every time it hits the resonant frequency of this plate, it's going to make a beautiful pattern. So if you have a hearing aid, you got to pull it out, or a dog in your purse. It's going to go nuts right now. So let's look at resonance, the visualization of resonance. That's my dog here. It's so beautiful. Isn't that crazy? It's so pretty. So if you picture those little grains of sand as the audience that you're trying to speak to, if you hit them at a resonant frequency, those little bits of sand, salt, they jumped up and moved on their own. They knew where to go. They knew the pattern to create. And I believe if you talk to people in a way that resonates with them, they'll jump up and move, and they'll make something collectively beautiful all on their own, without us having to prod and push and cajole them into doing what we want. They'll self-organize into something beautiful. And that's what happens when you send a signal through. And I thought, as I studied story, I also studied the greatest speeches of all time. And I thought, what if when the communicator sent a signal out, it undulated? They used story principles and it undulated. So after years of studying story, I actually found a pattern. And I thought, if this pattern is true, I should be able to overlay this pattern over two very different types of presenters. And if it overlays over them, then the pattern is true. So I took Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. I took Steve Jobs' 2007 iPhone launch speech. I overlaid the pattern, and it worked. The beauty of it is it looks a lot like this sine wave. And here's the shape of that pattern. And when I saw it was early on a Saturday morning, and not to be all female and melodramatic, but I actually fell on my knees and cried because I thought, if this is true, this could be used for good, or it could be used for evil. It could be used for the advancement of society, or to destroy it. So I was like a little bit overwhelmed, but it works. So I'm going to show you a ton of different patterns. If you want to see me go into Steve Jobs and Dr. King in detail, that's my TED Talk that Brett mentioned. I'm going to touch on them, but I'm actually analyzed a whole bunch more people today that nobody's ever seen. So you guys get to be the first audience to see some of my new material, which will be good. So the beginning, this breaks into a 3-act story structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning of any great piece of communication, you have to establish what is. This is where you're saying, here's our current reality. Here's the world we're operating in. Here's what's going on. Here's the elephant in the room. And the audience at that point, you should be getting consensus because they're like, yeah, you're pretty informed, yeah. So you're actually gaining in credibility because you're describing reality or the truth as everyone sees it. Then you introduce what could be. And that gap between what is and what could be should be really self-evident. This becomes like the inciting incident in a story. It's where the audience's world comes off balance a little bit, and they're like, what? You just said this is what is, and now you're saying we have to head this direction. By establishing what could be, what you're saying is, here's my bright hope of our future. Here's what could be. Here's our possibilities. And then the middle moves back and forth between what is and what could be as a structural device. So you're saying, here's what is, but look, here's what could be. And when you contrast what is with what could be, what's happening is suddenly what currently isn't appealing, and the future becomes more alluring when they see it contrasted with the current realities and even hardships of what we're going through today. So then, a lot of people end there with a call to action, but you need to actually state the new bliss. This is where you describe the future and how amazing it's going to be. This is our new normal. This is where we're going to be in the future. Now, there's the principle of recency that states people will remember the last thing you said more than they'll remember anything in the beginning or the middle. So you want that last thing you say to be amazing, okay? So this is the basic structure, and I'm going to run you through a bunch of talks that were done with insights from each one. So we will start with, I use it as an analysis tool, by the way. I transcribe these speeches. I throw prose into the what is column, and then I throw prose into the what could be column, and then I can analyze it over time. So I'm going to show you a whole bunch of these speeches, starting with Mr. Jobs. His 2007 iPhone launch speech was amazing. I loved this speech. It was 90 minutes long. I do not recommend that any CEO talk for 90 minutes, ever, but Steve Jobs did a good job. Now, he changed the world, completely changed personal computing, gutted the music industry, and then the way we communicate with the internet and each other is completely different because of the technology that Apple created. So this is the shape of his 90-minute talk. You can see he starts off with what is, moves back and forth between what is and what could be, ultimately ending high and to the right where he stated the new bliss. Every single one of them is different. Now you can see Mr. Jobs has a heightened sense of what could be. He's the most heightened sense of what could be of any speaker I've ever analyzed. Now what he did, the reason he could keep everyone engaged for 90 minutes was because of the amount of physical reaction from his audience. When I started to analyze it, it was astounding. Almost every 20 seconds he has the audience laugh. Almost every 20 seconds he has them clap. Laughing and clapping are physical reactions to his content. Really unheard of, to have that heightened sense sustained for 90 minutes. But the part that was the most astounding to me was how much Mr. Jobs marveled at his own product. He himself marveled at his new product more than the audience laughed and clapped combined. He's making exclamations, isn't this great? It's beautiful. Bam! Like he would say all these things to make you excited about his product. So what he was doing is modeling for you how he wanted you to feel about his product. I just wish more people would bring this kind of passion to what they do. It sure helps get you through a 90-minute talk for sure. So then there's Dr. King, Southern Baptist preacher, completely helped the civil rights movement. And the talk is actually about stories and symbols. So I want to talk about places, environments where you can give your speeches from. He chose to give his speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It's not only a sacred spot, but a historical location. He's standing at the foot of the statue of Abraham Lincoln, basically saying, the promises this guy made to me have been broken by those guys at the Capitol, right? So he actually used the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in his speech to explain to them that the promise was broken. It was a beautifully symbolic place to hold his speech. So he did a 16-minute talk, and this is the shape of that speech. You can see he starts off with what is, moves back and forth between what is and what could be as a structural device. Now you can see about 2/3 of the way through, the frequency gets really tight, and that's his very famous I Have a Dream sequence. Now the speech was not called the I Have a Dream speech. It was called The Urgency of Now. The people named it the I Have a Dream speech because where he used the gap between what is and what could be, he used it at the phrase level. I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day. When you talk about it at the phrase level, it becomes the most beloved parts of how we communicate. So I'm talking about speeches today, but this goes for emails, it goes for marketing material, it can even help you get your husband to do stuff on the weekend. It's really powerful tool. So it gets really tight there at the end, and that's what that's about. But at the end of his talk, because I want to touch on symbols, my next book's about stories and symbols, he also used a symbol during his talk. He lifted a song. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. This was a song that they had changed the words to in the anti-slavery movement, that they all sang together. Singing together is a very symbolic way to unite people. So they had sung this song together, and he picked that song. So if you think about resonance, resonance is finding something already in the hearts and minds of your audience and using that as a tool to get them to move to a new place in the future. So he picked this song that they'd sung together. But they had actually changed the words during the civil rights movement, the anti-slavery movement. They sang this song and they would say things like, my native country thee, where all men are born free, if white's thy skin. I love thy hills and dales, but hate thy Negro sails as foulest sin. So Dr. King brilliantly plucked this out of the culture as a symbol. It was a song they sang together to unite them, and a song they had sung together to incite them, and he picked this song to plant in his talk. And then the most dense amount of repetition happened right after that song. He says, let it ring from California, let it ring from New York, let it ring, let it ring, let it ring. It's a beautiful symbol to pull out of a culture. Now, every culture has symbols or signs or stories or rituals that you do that you could actually use to motivate people to move to a new place in the future. Super powerful talk. I think this is one of the most amazing talks ever. So then I want to touch on Nehru. He gave a talk in August 1947 on the eve of when India was going to be freed from British rule. He became a member of, he became the Prime Minister of India, and he gave a talk, and his talk is in perfect cadence. It's a very famous talk. It's India's version of their I Have a Dream speech, and it's called A Tryst with Destiny. You can see the cadence is almost perfect form. He actually moved back and forth in a way. It was perfect shape, the most perfect shape of all the ones I analyzed. What's interesting is that he chose to do a gap between India's suffering and how hopeful our future is going to be. So his structure was like, India has had this big, long quest, and it's been very difficult, but this is an opportunity for triumph. And then he would say, we need to acknowledge all of our pain and sorrow, but our suffering has ended. So he used this as a perfect storm, as a perfect structure. We've been a very fragmented country, and now we're going to be a joined country. He would say, the past has been clinging to us, but now a new hope rises. And one of the things that he did that was so interesting is the very last what is there, just before the ending. He went to the darkest place where he talked about the sacrifice and the suffering, because a lot of people had died in the battle for their freedom. But the hardest part was that a line was drawn, a boundary between two countries, and families were actually separated. So he addressed that. And then his ending, he poetically and beautifully had the people make a pledge. And then he did a blessed, "Oh, to India, my beloved motherland, I will be forever faithful to thee." It was so beautiful. He poetically made a vow of determination to make sure they made it through. Very beautiful. This is Richard Feynman. I think a lot of the engineers in the room will know who he is. Very famous Caltech professor. He taught science, physics specifically. And what's interesting about him is that he would use what I would call a star moment. And this is covered in Resonate. A star moment is an acronym for something they'll always remember. Students would come that weren't even taking his class, and they would come to attend his lectures just because he was interesting. So just like how Ronald Reagan is the great communicator, Richard Feynman is the great explainer. He would do things like in the auditorium, he would stand at the top of the stairs down while the students were sitting here. He would drop a bowling ball. Drop a bowling ball, the bowling ball would go to the other end, and then he would step down a stair. And as the bowling ball came, the whole place would just gasp, "Ah!" And it would just barely come to his face because he was trying to teach them the principle of gravity. He would not be struck because of gravity. Super, super good communicator. He gave a speech that became an 8-day media sensation. He actually prophesied subatomic particles being robots, which is basically nanotechnology as we would know it today. This is the shape of his talk. I thought, a geek, I thought that the frequency would be wide. I was startled that the more technical the talk and the greater the communicator, actually the tighter the frequency, which was a surprise to me. So what he did is he said, here's how physics works in the real world, but look, imagine if it worked like this in the atomic world. This is how it works here. What if we made little machines that could do these things at the subatomic level? Super fascinating. He actually referenced in his speech, in the year 2000, they're going to be laughing at me that it took us till 1960 to come up with this concept, which is so funny. So, super incredible communicator, super tight frequency, which is interesting. Margaret Thatcher, beloved and not so beloved. She gave an Iron Lady speech that you guys have all heard of. She was a bit of a master of contrast. The insight here about her that's super fascinating is that she actually used contrast at the phrase level to just beat Parliament. She would say, you can go and look at almost everything she said. It was like a 1-2 punch. She'd say, here's what it is, bam, like just like that here, and then she would just smack him verbally. Just her verbal structure, even if it wasn't a planned speech, was what is, what could be at the phrase level, which is so interesting. The reason this works is because contrast is important. We are hardwired as human beings to identify contrast. Oh, this stands out. Oh, this is different, because we're constantly processing our physical environment. And the same thing happens in our mental environment. Oh, that stood out. Oh, this is important. Oh, that's different than that. We're constantly processing like that. So the more you amp up the contrast, the more memorable what you have to say will become. So I want to talk about this guy who completely, whether you think he was God or man, I don't think matters, because definitely created a movement. What's interesting is a lot of people don't realize how dark society was before he came along. Women were dogs. They were treated like dogs. They were treated in society like dogs. So he was the very first egalitarian teacher who came along and gave women a seat, not only in the conversation, but a seat at the physical table, completely unheard of. Back then, they used to put the sick outside to the elements and just let them die. He would actually pick them up, hold them, touch them, love them. Children had no place in society, pulled them on their lap. I think his fans really screwed it up for him, because he was actually a pretty good guy. So he's pretty misrepresented. My favorite thing is he called the religious snakes. And I think some people don't realize how profound his teachings were and how much it actually altered society for us today and set the groundwork for that. So he did a talk called the Sermon on the Mount. It's the longest continuous piece of oration that we can find that he said. Interestingly, if you read it at 150 words a minute, it actually is the length of a TED Talk. It's about 17 and a half minutes, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, now we know where Chris Anderson got that. But look at how tight it is. This is by far the tightest one I ever analyzed. And you can see the very, very beginning is a sequence that's pretty famous called the Beatitudes. You know, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. So it's very rapid in the Beatitudes, and it goes by very, very quickly. Now, he was an Eastern story structure, so about 50% of what he said was about the bliss of the future, and the other 50% was about the consequence. If you build your house on the sand, metaphorically, the wind and rain will knock you down. So he would say things, and that's why most of what he said was inconclusive. He talked in parables and stories. And basically, if you do this, then this happens, and then the future is inconclusive. It's up to you to determine the outcome of how your life goes. Super interesting. So I want to talk about Eastern story structures, because we don't talk about that in business today. So I want to show an example of Sun Yat-sen. That's how you say it in English. I've been practicing my Chinese version. It's Sun Zhong Shan. Thank you. I know my family's like, what? At dinner, I'm like, Sun Zhong Song. Okay, so he actually was a revolutionary who helped with the, he was the founding father of the nation, and he helped overthrow the Qing dynasty. And he gave his most very famous speech is Pan-Asianism speech, and this is what it looks like. Interesting thing about this is he's mostly what is, which is fascinating to me. I've looked at him and Chiang Kai-shek and other very famous orators from China, and they do, a lot of them stay a lot in what is. So if you compare that one to Steve Jobs, heightened sense of what could be. So what happens, I'll go back to the one of Sun Yat-sen. I can't say it in Chinese too many times, I get all tongue-tied. What's interesting about this is that in Asian cultures, they value their past. Like for us, we'll be like, that is so 2012. And in Asian cultures, they'll tell stories from 3,000 years ago. They bring that forward as context, they bring it forward as context, and they value the history, so they spend a lot more time in what is and or what was, more so than others. But the thing that's different about an Eastern story structure is here our story structures are linear, here being Western story structures. We have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what happens in our movies is the boy gets the girl, they kiss, and they kill all the aliens. And that's what we love, right? It's a positive resolution. It's how we tell our stories. But in Asian story structures, they don't do that. A lot of times it's like, the aliens came and ate him and he's dead. Don't do that, right? That's how their stories end. It's like, and learn from them because they made a big mistake. And so that's kind of what they do. They bring the past forward. They also have a very famous phrase that says, if you know shame, you know courage. So sometimes bringing up the stories of the past is saying they made a mistake. And they feel like a lot of times when they talk, if we talk about how bad it is or was, it will inspire them. Very different than Western story structures where we want to hear about this inspiring future. They actually talk about how the past wasn't so great, which is interesting. So a lot of people, there's just a gap. You can actually see the gap between the two. And if you have too heightened of a sense of what could be, and you're talking to a bunch of Chinese businessmen, you'll alienate yourself because they feel like you're not telling the truth. So, like I said, Western stories are linear. Eastern story structures are circular. They actually make a spiral, to me. I've run this by a lot of people, including the Stanford Narrative Studies program, and they said absolutely this is right. So, you can see that you have to hint at what's going on. We like a very clear call to action. Just tell me really clearly what you want me to do. In Eastern story structures, you have to hint. You have to move them closer and closer and closer to the central part of your idea, but never insult them by stating what that idea is, right? So here is the thing, hint and hint and hint and draw them in closer. So if you were to draw a line through this spiral and you were to name one side what could be and what is, you can see by naturally entering to what is first, it's going to make the what is part just mathematically longer than the what could be part. Does that make sense? Very different shape. And if you go into your conversations with other cultures with this mindset of really understanding the historical stories and the structures they use to tell them, it should help you be a better communicator and kind of reconcile Eastern and Western tension around how we communicate. And then there's this gal. I get asked all the time, well, Nancy, you cover all these very famous men. Who do you think is the greatest female communicator? And it took me a long time to find her. And I believe I have found her. This is Evita Peron. She has had a musical named after her. So my daughter and I went to this. It stars Ricky Martin, who's hot. And but it was written by a couple of men. Okay, so it was Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice wrote a musical about her life. And in the musical, she stands at a big fat microphone and she sings Don't Cry For Me, Argentina. So I saw it and I'm like, oh, that's right, she must have spoke a lot. She might have done a lot of speeches. And then a few months later, late last year, they put her face on the 100 peso bill in Argentina. I'm like, maybe I should dig around, poke around a little bit and see a little bit about this lady. I was really astounded because I couldn't find any of her talks in English. People had not transcribed them. Here is a woman who got a crowd of 2 million people. That's how many were there that day that she gave this talk, 2 million people. It's really rare to have any gatherings in the whole world on that kind of scale, let alone in 1946 to come and hear a female speak. So, yeah, she was born in poverty. She was actually born illegitimately and then orphaned by her dad. So she did flee her little country home and went into Buenos Aires because she wanted to be a radio star. And she did sleep with some men. And that's where the musical ends. It made her out to be a slut. So what did she say? What were the things that she did that I think make her more amazing? Number one, she brought women's suffrage. On her deathbed, she got the right to vote because of the work she did. She was the very first female in the world to campaign for her husband, who actually won the election. She started a foundation where she gave hundreds of millions of dollars away to the poor because she connected so deeply with the poor, and the wealthy hated her. The elite despised Evita. They just hated her because she had no right to have a seat at that table. They hated her. And they would do all kinds of things to try to destroy her and her reputation, but she continued to give. She would give hundreds of thousands of pots away so the women could clean, hundreds of thousands of shoes to their children so they would be safe, hundreds of thousands of sewing machines so the women could create industries. She made and built entire neighborhoods for the poor that are actually still around today. Amazing. The other thing that she did was when she would run her foundation, people would stand in line and actually tell her. They'd look her in the eye and tell her what they needed. How amazing is that? And if they had open sores or some terrible sickness, she would kiss them. She would kiss their face. These rejected, terrible, oppressed people, she loved them. She would just love on them. And then she always had this weird thing about dentures. She thought every woman should have a pretty smile when her husband came home, so she bought hundreds of thousands of dentures for women too, which is kind of a crack up. But is she a saint or a slut? So here's the shape of her talk. It was 10 minutes long. She gave it from the scaffolding of this huge plaza, and 2 million people came out to hear her talk. She was campaigning for her husband to be the vice president of Argentina. To be the president, excuse me. She was campaigning for him to be the president of Argentina. So she knew that because she came from poverty, everything she had to do had to be to bring Perón more power or more affection from the people so that she could move up with him, because she knew she wasn't qualified to hold any position of power, and besides, the wealthy completely hated her. So she did something very interesting. 13 times in her talk, she used the term el descamisados. Now, this was a symbol. I was saying we would talk a little bit about symbols today. What she did is she took this term that the elite had used as a form to discriminate against Perón's followers. They would say el descamisados, like in disgust, and that meant the shirtless ones. El descamisados, they're so disgusting, they don't even have a shirt for their back. That's what they would say. So what she did is she took this term, el descamisados, and turned it into a form of affection. She would say, oh, el descamisados, my shirtless ones. And she would just pour out her affection for this term that had meant they were reviled. He even named his campaign train el descamisados, and they would campaign around in that train. This is how she would show her affection. My general, they are your glorious shirtless vanguards who are present today like they were yesterday and will forever be willing to give their life for Perón. She crafted her words so carefully. Now, keep in mind, she worked 20 to 22 hours in her foundation and still had the time to craft some language that I believe is on par with Dr. Martin Luther King. It's really powerful. So she used another form of contrast where she lashed out at the elite. This is what you can do. You can lash out at your competitors. She would just lash at the elite, and she would say, those wealthy ones, they hate you. They hate Perón for giving you a voice, right? So she would use this form of contrast. But then she gave them back their dignity. She actually made them feel like they were more enlightened, that they were poor, than the rich are. She would say, the humble who, because they live and sleep in open air, they have the windows of their soul always exposed to extraordinary things. My general, it is the shirtless that see you through the eyes of their soul, and for that reason, they understand you. They follow you. This is so beautiful. So beautiful. They are more enlightened that they have no pillow for their bed than the ones who do. I just feel a sense of advocacy for Evita, because her maiden name was Duarte. So I need to at least get her the exposure she deserves. So then she used repetition, just like Dr. King did. She used repetition a lot. Tell the shirtless that everything I have, everything I do, that everything I think, that everything I own does not belong to me. It belongs to Perón because he gave me everything. So she used repetition, and she knew, I am nothing and he is everything. I do not deserve to be here today. The thing that was really cool, she was not afraid to show her feminine affection. So not only did she get a platform, which was unheard of in the 40s, but she actually was very feminine about how she showed her affection. So she said in her salutation, to you shirtless of my country, everyone who is listening to you, I symbolically press you very, very strong upon my heart. So she just gushed over these poor, impoverished, they had no shoes, they had no shirts, there's just poor, poor people. And then something happened that I've never seen in spoken history in my life. She's done with her speech technically, but what happens is the audience starts to pulse. 2 million people, they start to gather in momentum and they start to chant, Evita con Perón, Evita con Perón. They were insisting that she run on the ticket as her husband's vice president. That's unheard of, right? So she starts to have a conversation. No, I don't want to run for vice president. I live for Perón. Evita con Perón. Lash the elite. Evita con... No, compadres, that's not my goal. And she's just having this intense conversation with 2 million people, where 2 million people are chanting for a chick to be in power. Like, why did this happen so many years ago and it doesn't happen today? So what happened is she's so stinking exhausted from this exchange. She collapses into her arms of her husband and she says, they will not accept that I don't want to be the vice president. In fact, they insisted so vehemently, she had to make a radio address 9 days later and say to the country, I am not running for the vice president. It's her very famous renunciation speech. I'm not running. That's pretty amazing. I love this. What makes me cry is that her words are not in the English language and nobody knows about her. Thinks she was a slut instead of a saint. Pretty powerful communicator. So I want to close with this and say, our job as communicators, your job as employees of LinkedIn, is to imagine an amazing future. How do you imagine a future? You're all caught up in your day-to-day. You're coming in working 10, 12 hours a day. How do you imagine a better future? Well, one of the things you've got to do is you've got to remove yourself from your current realities. I covered people who created movements. I covered people who changed the world. And I hear all the time, well, I'm normal. I'm an engineer at LinkedIn. And I'm not going to do those kinds of things. Well, a lot of the people we covered today were normal too. Steve Jobs was a college dropout. Dr. King was a preacher. Jesus, a carpenter. You've got Evita, an orphan. I mean, if you look at the history of some of these people, they're not qualified to be great communicators. But what happens though is we get so sucked up in our day, we don't get the distance. So what you have to do emotionally, mentally, is you have to distance yourself from what is. And you have to go somewhere. I go to Rancho San Antonio and I hike. I love this place. I'm up there as often as I can. I distance myself from reality, and at the top is this bench, and I can overlook the valley, and I can actually sit and just dream. I pretend it's my higher vantage point, and I dream about my future in the valley, which is important for me to do. Now, before this place was called the Silicon Valley, it was actually called the Valley of the Heart's Delight, and I love that. That's what it was called because people could come to this valley and just pick fruit off the trees. And for so many of us, that's what it's really been. We get to pick the fruit of great ideas and prosper and have food to eat and drink to drink. So you have to kind of distance yourself from your current reality and then dream about a greater future. Okay? And you got to use your prophetic imagination. You have to actually declare. You go away like even Moses, it's in Susan Cain's book, even Moses went away to the mountain, distanced himself, got the tablets, came back down, right? But you have to prophesy your own future. You have to say, this is the way my future is going to be. This is the kind of woman I'm going to be. This is the kind of amazing abolishment we can have of sex slave trade. Whatever is your vision and your dream, you have to speak it. You have to write it. You have to write it on tablets. That's what I do. I write my dream and my vision down. But you got to imagine something great. And you can use your imagination to do that where you imagine a glorious future. And then you need to poetically visualize it. That's what all these people did. They use these words. We just don't craft our words today. We pound out an email, we pound out a white sheet, we white paper, we do a blog post, and then we tweet. Whatever's on our mind, tweet. Whatever's on our mind, Facebook, post it. And we just spastically throw these things in there. And we've lost the ability to craft these poetic words. And what happens is when you craft something really well, I think every company vision, every company purpose should be worded so well, it makes people crave to work there. Because something about poetry is expansive, right? It includes everything. It's conductive. It conducts energy. But it also is contemplative. It makes you think. It has enough holes and space in it for people to dream outside of what the true words say. So what I'm hoping for you guys is that you learn to be great communicators. And this is what a great communicator would do. If you want to build a ship, that's what LinkedIn is trying to do. We're building this ship. Don't drum up people together and collect wood. And don't assign them tasks and work. But rather, teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. If you guys get them to pine and crave for the future that you're trying to create, they'll go there on their own. So I want to thank you guys for being such world changers in the room. Thank you. And I'm open it for questions. Thank you. I have one major announcement that we're technically not announcing for a couple days. And I know you guys have 24/7 books here. But if you write down resonate.duarte.com, we are releasing first ever multimedia book for free, full length, totally immersive video, massive amounts of videos. We got people in there talking about the hero's journey. We got Reagan, we got MLK, we got Nehru. We got a lot of the examples given today. And it's going to be for free up there. And it's a completely different experience when you see it from with all the video and everything around it. So, but I want to take questions.
Yes, I was going to say, so now's the time for questions. We have a bunch coming in on the stream, but we can open it up to folks here, and then we'll go to the stream.
So you've talked a lot about the what is and what could be, and you mentioned a little bit in the Eastern speeches about what was. Is that something you just very much conflate with what is? It pretty much acts the same way, or does it have any separate
what
properties?
was and what is are the same thing, because what was informs what is, so I don't look at them as separate. I think your past is, like, if you look at the present as one moment in time, everything from that very second is really history that's created what is. So it is, what was.
Thanks.
Come on, you guys got questions.
So, one from the stream. What's the star moment, right? I think you define star as something they will always remember. What's the star moment here that you would want us to take away?
Oh, what's my
if there was
star
one
moment?
one thing that everyone could take that would forever change how they
I
do a
think...
story.
I think you kind of started off with the fact that I feel called to help people communicate, and there's so many people in this room might have the answer to some of the world's hardest questions and biggest problems, and we just don't have the guts to communicate, or we don't feel we're qualified to be a good enough communicator. And my hope is that as I speak, especially since this looks and is so analytical, there's actually a process and a method to the madness, is this tension of what is and then the release of what could be. It creates this pulsing story pattern, and my hope would be that people feel enabled and empowered now to take these hidden dreams inside of you and actually do something with them. And find something you care about. If you don't care enough to be a great communicator because you work at LinkedIn, then find something that you care enough to become a great communicator for, because what will happen is when you bring those great communication skills back to LinkedIn, you'll see your career change and grow quicker than it would should you not choose to become a better communicator. A question from a real person.
Hi, Nancy. Really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I know you mentioned about a few people who came from humble beginnings, and I heard your TED talk. If you can share your own humble beginnings, I think it'll be pretty enlightening for the folks in this session today.
Yeah, I tried to trim anything in the talk. I was raised in an economically and emotionally starved environment. I didn't even talk until I was 5. They thought I had development issues, and then I started talking complete sentences. So go figure. But what's interesting is there was everything that comes with an economically challenged environment, all the kinds of abuse and everything like that. And then my mom left when I was 16 years old. We came home, and there was a note saying, we were in Mississippi at the time, pick up the car at the airport, I've moved to California. And so I wound up taking on the role of mom. I don't know why. I just started doing the laundry, doing the shopping, doing the cooking, even though I'm third from the oldest. And I went to a year of college, because that's what you're supposed to do, and my grandfather had left me just a little bit enough for a semester. So I went to University of Southern Mississippi, and that's in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. If you're unfamiliar with Hattiesburg, Mississippi, it is where Tiger Woods had his sex therapy, in case that clarifies anything for you. But I went to a year of college there, and I got a C- in speech communications. And I got a D in English. So now I write books in English about speech communications. But I quit. I gave up. It was too hard. It was just too difficult to be rejected. So this C- that I got in speech communication, I actually got an A+ in the visual display of information, because I'm primarily visual, secondarily auditorial. I got a A in the visual aids, because I brought the best props. I mean, I didn't just talk about heartworm in dogs. I brought a heart with worms in it from a dog, right? And so I had great visuals, but I actually got an F in connecting to the audience. And so that failure actually has led me to do what I think is one of my greatest piece of work, which is Resonate, which is some of the insights that you guys heard today. And I got married when I was 18. My husband rescued me from my dilemma in Hattiesburg, and we moved to California. I was 18 years old, and we just celebrated our 32nd year anniversary. He actually founded my company, and I joined him 2 years later. So I'm not qualified. I don't even have like a college degree. And Cisco, one of my big clients, they actually paid me to get my MBA from UCLA, and they talked him into waiving all my requirements and stuff, and they let me get an MBA from UCLA, which meant a lot to me. And just in April this year, University of Southern Mississippi, the one I failed out of, gave me Entrepreneur of the Year award. And it was an amazing moment to close this circle of, you sit in rooms with CEOs. I just walk in the room, I start telling them, look, this is dumb what you're saying, right? They didn't know. I just was super well read, super street smart. And so to have this kind of hole inside of me that said, you're dumb, even though that was my outside persona, my internal story was like, okay, you're really dumb. You couldn't even get through college. You're telling these people what to say and do. And so I think getting that award in Mississippi kind of closed that voice that used to tell me I can't do this, that I'm not qualified to do it. And now I just do it with a little more passion. So that's my longer version of my personal story. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
We have a lot of questions coming in from the stream.
I'll answer them more quickly now.
Keith Ritchie. What if your day job doesn't involve giving presentations? How do you bring your stories to live in relatively mundane channels like email, on a conference call, on a whiteboard, etc.?
I think, it's funny, I'll sit in a meeting, like a one-on-one with my staff, and they're like, oh my God, even your conversations move back and forth between what is and what could be. I think it's just part of it right now. I think it's more interesting to actually use it. So number one, love the question, but I hate that you called your job mundane. Like, I think that no job is mundane. It's as interesting, as exciting as we personally make it. And we have seen, like, we had a large medical system. Someone came through and learned these principles, and he went from manager to director to VP in 6 months. And it was based solely on how he changed, how he communicated about his mundane job. So I really think that the principles work no matter what you're trying to convey. And it's all about perspective. Yeah.
Hey, Nancy.
Hi.
Thank you for being so inspiring. Very inspiring.
Thanks.
We actually have a Toastmasters club at LinkedIn. Here we meet once a week. I wonder if you could just put in a plug for Toastmasters and see if you can convince some of these people to come join us every Friday at Culture Club.
Every Friday, come to Toastmasters. Toastmasters is really good. It helps you get out, get more comfortable with who you are and how you convey who you are. And I think that's really important because so much of how we communicate is through our body language. So if you're like scared like this, like you lose your credibility based solely on your eye contact, your gestures, and how you communicate. So it is a really important skill to have. And not just for presentations, but even when you're sitting in a meeting or trying to sell a product, all those things are really important.
Yeah, Nancy is totally right. See you Friday.
Yeah, that's cute.
Nancy, we have one from Erin Hoslick, who's one of our communications leaders here at LinkedIn. And she wanted to know, who are your favorite speakers and why?
Well, Evita is kind of high on the list because her maiden name's Duarte, but I covered that. Obviously I covered, a lot of the ones I covered are not alive anymore. And I think that's actually symptomatic that great oration just doesn't happen as much anymore outside of the politicians. So I'm waiting for the day when a really phenomenal communicator rises up. I think Sheryl Sandberg's on her way there. I think she's a very good communicator. But it's really hard to find too many outside of that. I mean, we can point to some great TED Talks, but do they do it once for just a great TED Talk, or are they really great communicators? So as far as in the spoken word category, we're missing some. There's a hole there that some of you guys could fill. So, yeah. Come on up, somebody in the audience.
I have another question. I'm just noticing a pattern of this. A lot of the speakers you brought up is in many ways their lives follow the sort of contrasting narrative that you described. I mean, you have with Evita the poverty and reaching out, and so they kind of have the contrast of facing some challenges and acting in a symbolic way that shows people what is. I mean, do you have any advice for how to act the narrative, not just communicate the narrative?
It's interesting because when you become a student of story, you're changed. Like when I jumped into story, I actually can use story now as a coping mechanism. And the basic 3-act story structure is that there's this likable person who's in circumstances they just don't deserve. And then they get this call to adventure where they can join this exciting adventure or choose to reject it. And the ones that reject the adventure don't become anything really. And so many times that's where so many of us stop. 3-act story structure. There's this likable person. They encounter all these roadblocks and they emerge transformed. So what happens is in life, we're this likable person that we want everyone to root for us, and then we go through these terrible hardships, and we get stuck. So many people, even in this room, are kind of stuck in the second act, right? Where we're in the middle of hardships and we never actually see that we can rise above it, get through it, and be transformed. And that's where story is kind of a coping mechanism for me. I go through something hard, I'm like, oh, I'm just in the middle of the story. I'm going to actually, get through the end of this. So it is, their lives follow, and ours do too, kind of this 3-act story structure, and life's hard. And so many times when we show up at work and we pretend it's not. We don't want to share our personal stories. And I'll tell you, I will follow a leader who has failed and talks about it before I will follow a leader who pretends life isn't hard. And so that's the power of story, is that it will rally people, and you can actually get them to be endeared to you when you're more exposed. But people don't want to do that today. It's harder for them. But yet we love the stories where people triumphed over these terrible situations. So yeah, you basically identified the 3-act story structure that people go through in life.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Nancy. I have a question about using visuals. I'm a designer here, and many of us give presentations that involve keynotes, animations, where demonstrating a prototype or talking about a strategy. Do you have any sort of high-level tips and tricks or do's and don'ts for us?
Yeah, I think no matter what you're conveying, it's nice to have a story to it. And I see so many people do software demos where it'll be like John Smith. Like, you can actually create a day in the life where it's a real human with a real human story of how LinkedIn brings them triumph. So I think putting story into your demos, that's what Steve Jobs does brilliantly. He doesn't just demo something, there's always a human in it. Like, oh look, I have visual voicemail. Oh, I have one from Al Gore. Click, and he plays a voicemail. All that was planned. It looked like it wasn't, but it really was. So I would say humanize it as much as possible. But I would also say I think Keynote and tools like that are amazing for rapid prototyping of software. So absolutely use it for that. We actually are launching in mid-January a new way to use presentation tools. We've come up with a new type of a presentation called a slide doc, which is probably what you use, where it's not this cinematic presentation where you can go into some of your dense tech pubs and where you have to convey really dense information and stick it in PowerPoint. It's still a great tool for that. But what happens is people then stand up and they present their dense documents instead of distributing them like a document. So we've got this new piece of information. So if you have this really dense thing that you've designed, it shouldn't be presented. It should be read and processed instead of having a verbal stream, because people read and process visually twice as fast as you can communicate verbally. So they sit there like, you're wasting my time, I figured it out. So sometimes if you are projecting, so just stay quiet, let everyone process it, and then say, do you have questions, instead of like verbally, because it just drags how much time it takes to get through stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're at 11:57 and 59 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze one more in there then.
Okay.
So this is from Nishant Vyas. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. How do you make sure your audience is engaged? You did such a great job today of keeping this audience engaged. How do you make sure they're engaged? And then how do you keep your focus if, not this audience, of course, if your audience is not connecting with you?
Yeah, so I think those are two very good and very different questions. So I will take the what do you do if your audience isn't engaged with you question. I talked about story as people having a physical reaction to it. And so I can see like, oh, pretty much everyone is looking at me while I'm talking. You guys aren't looking at the ceiling or falling asleep, right? Are people leaning forward? Are they looking, Are they looking like they're actually looking at what I'm saying? So you could physically read an audience to know if they're engaged. If they are not engaged, stop in your tracks and say, I can tell this is not interesting to you. Does someone want to say why you came here, that you wanted to hear me say that I haven't said yet? Because I really want you guys to enjoy the hour that you gave me, because I know this hour was a really big sacrifice. So could you guys throw some topics out there, and we'll just do it as a Q&A, because what I'm saying is clearly not interesting to you. How awesome would that be? And if nobody has any questions, be like, how about I give you the hour back in your day? Like, who does that? So I think you can read the audience and you know. And if you see that they're not engaged or not interested, then you blew it. It has nothing to do with them. You screwed up. Yeah?
A friend of mine taught me a trick when you're presenting.
A friend taught him as a trick when he's presenting. I'll relay it for everybody.
Sorry, a friend taught me a trick if you're presenting and you're losing your audience. If you hit the B button in PowerPoint, that makes the screen go blank. Everyone will be, what?
Yeah.
They look around, it's like, okay, now we're back.
Now we're back. Yeah, any sort of visual disruption. You can hit the B key, it goes black, the W key goes white. And those are ways to just turn the media off and get their attention. So we are wired to process anything that moves physically in our space. It's part of our fight or flight instinct. So if you can make something move, or you even move a little and you move around a little, you're at least trying hard to keep them awake. So there's more than just what is and what could be that could be contrast. You can throw different kinds of media. You can have different presenters up with you. Steve Jobs did that all the time. There's other ways to do contrast by having different voices, different perspectives up with you on the stage. And then to your point, have things changing up visually. I'm going to walk over here, I'm going to do a demo, I'm going to talk. Let's bring Phil Schiller up. Let's bring the Google CEO up, or whoever. Like, they were really good at like bringing multiple people up at the same time. So that's a very good question. So it's 12 o'clock, and are you coming back up, or
I'm just
close
coming up
it
to
down?
thank you, because this was so inspiring. So how about a
You're
huge
so
round of applause for Nancy Duarte? One of my biggest takeaways, and you almost can't hear it enough, is the contrast between what is and what could be to really differentiate your storytelling. So thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom
Go
with
dream
us.
about your future and make it happen.
And I would just recommend everyone from here at LinkedIn, go check out Nancy's book, Resonate. It is an incredible backdrop to what you heard today that will reinforce a lot of what she talked about. Thanks again for joining us.